I will find you, and I will kill you. That is one of the most awesome movie lines of the last 20 years. So it was said by Liam Neeson in the film Taken, and the minute I saw this game between Firouzja and Aronian, it instantly reminded me of that film. So Alireza had white here, Levon had black. It was played in the New In Chess Classic in 2021. It was an online rapid, and watch what happened here. So Aronian thought he was snug as a bug on the king side, but Firouzja hunted him down. And if you love a daily chess video, do hit that subscribe button to never miss one. So we went in for this London system, but it's a bit different here because Firouzja's already played the knight to f3. He's not started with bishop f4. And so after this c5 move, pawn to e3, queen to b6, there's no defensive move of queen to b3 here because we've not yet played pawn to c3. Equally, the knight's not on d2. So instead we had knight c3 here. And this now starts to move back into what's been known as the Jabava London system recently because Badur Jabava has played it a lot. So it's a poison pawn variation. If you take here, then knight b5 is really strong. There's a lot of problems here. Knight a6 is a very ugly way to defend. So that's why the pawn wasn't taken. Bishop d7 was played to cover this b5 square. And now rook b1 comes because the pawn really is on prise. So we had e6 now from Aronian, and both players just start developing some pieces here as we can see. Standard development moves, and now Aronian decides to take in the centre here. He brings his rook to that newly half-open file. We had a3 from Firouzja, covering this square which is looked at by two minor pieces and could be used in some lines. Bishop to e7, rook to e1 now, castles from Aronian, and this is where the opening phase you can say is now finished. So Aronian looks safe and secure on the king side, lots of minor pieces around. How can Firouzja flush out that king here? Well, let's see what happened. So first off, bishop d3, opening the eyes of the rook, improving that piece to look down at the king. Now we had pawn to a6, okay, steady move, preparing a queenside expansion later. Black is still very solid. Knight to e5 now from Firouzja, so he leaves this pawn on prise because if you take it as black, then bishop e3 is really strong. This pin is deadly, and there's also tactics of bishop takes on h7 in the air, opening up the queen here as we can see. So you can't take that pawn. Instead, Aronian brought a rook to the centre, overprotecting this bishop, and he doesn't mind the capture here too much, giving white the bishop pair because that's the bad bishop looking at its own pawns. So instead we had this move of bishop to g5. Firouzja just starts probing at the king side now. Really instructive. Now I would say that best here for Aronian would have been pawn to h6. You ask a question of that bishop, does it want to come back or come here? And you don't really want to take here as white, or after the recapture, queen h5 just doesn't carry the same venom because the bishop can drop back and defend f7 and there's no problems with the h7 pawn. In the game, however, there was a problem with that pawn. So Aronian went king to f8 here, protecting this bishop in some lines if there was an exchange with the knight on c6. And now we had simply bishop takes on f6. The bishop recaptured, the queen jumped out, and now black's got some problems to solve. So this pawn is attacked immediately, and it was defended with bishop to e8. Now knight g4 came, so hitting this dark squared bishop, lots of pressure on this pawn. What's black going to do? Well, the best here was actually a rather unhuman way to play of pawn to g6. Now the whole idea is that now after white takes this pawn, you can actually take the pawn on d4 with the queen. So you're giving your dark squared bishop in these lines because obviously the knight is attacked here, so you could have a line like this. But although you've got these dark squared weaknesses and no bishop, actually the queen does a good defensive job. But okay, it's hard to play like this as a human because when you go g6, you open up your dark squares, you're giving the dark squared bishop. Aronian played the more natural bishop takes on d4, preserving that bishop, not opening up the king, but now the queen takes here. And Aronian's going for a run now. He wants to get that king to the other side of the board and just evacuate the danger area. so king e7 comes. Now we had knight e2, an excellent remanoeuvring of that knight. It opens the c pawn to come to c3 soon, and also it could be coming into f4 in some lines. So you don't want to take here on b2 with the bishop, that's suicidal walking into this pin, so instead Aronian carries on running with the king to d6. Now we had pawn to c3, bishop e5, and now a really classy move from Firouzja. He just nudges this bishop back to c2, opening up the d file here and asking black how he wants to proceed in this tricky position, and Aronian goes immediately wrong. So probably best here was king to c7, and then say you had a line like this where the bishop gets chopped, the knight recaptures, you can pick up on g7 now, and after say knight to c4, black is at least getting the king to safety, although I can see why Aronian didn't go for this because you're just a pawn down, the attack rages on, and this one's a really dangerous passer. So instead he tries to mix it up. Instead of playing king c7, he plays pawn to f6, but this allows the queen to take on g7 immediately, cutting the king's retreat route. So now we had bishop to h5, and this is what Aronian was playing for, a quick bishop h5, rook's coming to the g-file, counterplay. But what he'd overlooked is that after knight takes on f6, he's not actually getting the play he hoped for. This knight covers that square, and although you're walking into a pin here, after rook c7, there's an excellent tactical move that keeps the attack going. If you want to pause and look for it, then please do so. So knight e4 check, thunderbolt of a move, ripping open the black position. Now that d-file is just getting blasted by the rooks. So the check came, the king came to c5, b4 check, and the king is just now getting lured down the board, the hunt is on. So now the queen moves away, it does need to get out of the attacks. It hits this bishop here, but also hits the e6 pawn. So you don't have time to say play bishop takes on e2, or queen takes here with check. And this is actually leading to checkmate after this sequence here. So that's why after the queen came into h6 here, Aronian took on b4, opening up the defence of the queen on that pawn. Firouzja now took the bishop on h5. There were lots of options here for how to win it, but this was a clean one. And now the bishop's attacked here, so it takes on c3. And now the knight recaptured there. And here again, Aronian has options. It's all losing. He decides to save the knight here and take the bishop on c2, but this runs into rook takes on e4 check, the king gobbled on c3. Now Firouzja picked up this rook here, and there's no back rank checkmate issues because then you just drop the rook back, supported by the queen here. So instead of this, Aronian ran the king into b2 after the rook got captured, trying to get to the corner, but queen e5 check, king takes on a3, and rook d3 were the final moves of the game. The king is getting mated. Best is giving up the queen here. If you come to a2, then you're simply running into a checkmate, which could look something like this. Awesome king hunt by Firouzja. If you want to see another amazing Aronian Firouzja game, click here. Thanks very much for watching, and see you soon.